Sorry about that, everyone. I had somebody pop in the office right when I was going to start. I want to thank everybody for coming to this training, and I want to welcome you. And I want to introduce our contractors that we're working with from Widow Bryan's, who are going to put these on. We are recording them, and then they will be linked to our website. So you can go back and look at them, or you can, people who, don't get to be on this meeting can turn around and look at it later. So welcome everybody. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chelsea and Matt and Aaron. Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle. And thank you, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for the first of these training sessions where we're going to discuss accessing mitigation grants. And today we're going to cover how to identify mitigation projects and how to match those projects to funding, specifically the difference between non-disaster grants and disaster grants, and then next steps to moving forward with accessing that funding. So first, how do we identify mitigation projects, particularly for those that we want to get funded under FEMA Emergency Management Agency funding? So for those of you who have a disaster and emergency management background, this disaster cycle may look pretty familiar. We spend most of our time preparing for the next bad day. And then when the bad day comes, we then have to respond to and recover from those bad days, those disasters. Disasters can bring many problems to the surface and help point out some of our gaps and needs. And it can feel like we won't know where we need to focus our attention and what is at risk until we have those bad days. Y'all had a series of pretty bad days back in 2017 when you experienced these back-to-back atmospheric rivers, which caused, it impacted 5 counties and 3 tribes, kept the state activated for 3 months. Recovery activities lasted for 8 and included an SBA declaration. One sort of mitigating factor involved in these events was the Carson City's, is it VC or Vichy Basin, which included a series of smaller catch basins and protected a large section of the city for runoff during these events. And the point of this is that mitigation is working when we don't make the news. It's working when we implement projects prior to the bad day so that when the bad day comes, we are able to recover more quickly. Nobody loses their house. Nobody loses their life. The idea is that mitigation is done prior to the bad day, and the bad day isn't as bad as it could have been. To get there, we have to identify our goals. You may know right now what your community's goals are. You may know what your focus is. You may have it present in your mind, what you want to do with your next couple of weeks, what you want to do with your next couple of dollars. But if you don't, or if you're not sure where to look, the place to start is here. So just out of curiosity, how many people sitting on the call today have participated in a local hazard mitigation planning process? If I could see like the little at the top of your screens, little raise your hand. Can you raise your hand if you have contributed data, sat in on a meeting, answered a survey? I'm seeing 4 people maybe. Okay. So your hazard mitigation planning process is where this begins. It is a required aspect of hazard mitigation funding to access funding, and is a great place to look if you don't know where to start. We say that there's no such thing as plagiarism in mitigation. And if you have a neighboring jurisdiction or your state's hazard mitigation plan or the next county over, the next state over had a good idea, steal it. And particularly there's work that has been done by your jurisdiction, not just under hazard mitigation plans, but under a variety of different planning efforts that you can utilize to figure out where your focus is as an organization, as a community, as an entity, who your neighbors are, who your partners are, who might have similar needs and goals, where is your development happening, where are you headed? all of this work that's already been done, all this paperwork that's already been completed, you can go as a great resource to get started on your mitigation process. Other things to consider are your important things. So when you're talking about natural hazard mitigation, we want to think about what do we want to protect? Where are our gaps? Where are our goals? Where are our needs? These important things can take a variety of different forms and can be both the physical assets, like the critical facilities, and also your capability and capacity. You want to think about what kind of staff and personnel you might need to access, what kind of skills you might need. There's going to be eligibility pieces included in this. We're going to get into that in a little bit there. But first, to identify what does your community need, what does your community want, and how are you going to get there? Included in this planning process and included in identifying where your gaps and needs are, you also might want to consider your opportunities for partners. We're not operating in a vacuum. Sometimes these partners exist within your communities. Sometimes they exist within neighboring communities. And here is just a quick snapshot of a variety of entities that may or may not be an opportunity for you to leverage partnerships, for you to access people with different skill sets than you, people who have goals that can align with you, people that may or may not have been involved in the planning processes that have occurred previously in those slides, the ones that I mentioned on the slide before, but opportunities to get your goals accomplished. Just as an example of these opportunities to partner, there was an entity that needed some wildfire mitigation work done. And this particular entity had a youth group that they also needed. They would like to encourage their community youth to engage in the community, to give back, and to also have something to do with their time. So they wanted to hire, to form a youth corps. And they also had sort of completely disparate from this, just talking, in meetings and groups and having conversations. They wanted to implement a program for their senior citizens to cook food that was part of their youth, so part of their culture. And so by implementing by creating the youth corps, they were able to get mitigation dollars to utilize the youth corps as workforce to implement the wildfire mitigation project. And that youth corps, because they were being utilized and accessing funding for that mitigation project, were freed up with the additional funds that they could use to fund the mitigation, to fund the youth corps, to implement youth corps in creating the food for the senior citizens program. So when you identify a variety of different needs to variety of different goals, and you can figure out how to leverage your partners and leverage those goals, you can get multiple goals accomplished simultaneously. You get a youth corps established, you get funding through the mitigation program to complete your wildfire mitigation, and then you can access additional funds for those other goals that you want to reach. And everybody gets their programs implemented at the end of the day. So think inside your own organization, think outside your organization, and try to figure out where you can leverage those cross purposes. Questions to consider. When you're thinking about what your communities might need, are there communities, participants, just regular everyday Joes who have voiced a need? Is there a specific residential area that has been raising an issue? Are there, if you have a consideration for what you might want to do, like a particular road that goes down or a bridge that goes down, maybe you as an entity are losing money in one place, but the community residents in another area are having that same problem, and that's the project that they'd like to focus on because that's the main pathway to get them from point A to B, and that's the project that they would really prefer. Are there ideas of what the problems should be, but you don't know how to fix them? Like maybe you've had that bad day and oh my gosh, that bridge is such a problem, but I don't even know where to begin or how much it's gonna cost to fix. I know it's a problem, but I just don't know how to get there yet. Are there, like we said, are there other partners that could enhance the project? Is this the right area? Are you having a drainage issue in one residential area, but really when you look at that, area, it's the problem way upstream. Actually, if we could fix it, 2 miles upstream, that would save a whole headache down the road. Are there other solutions to be considered? So in this beginning process here, in this beginning phases, we're just kind of asking a lot of questions and trying to figure out what are your needs, what are your goals, what are your gaps, so that we can then move into matching your projects with your funding. Out of curiosity, has anybody on this session here ever accessed or applied for mitigation funding in the past? Has anybody submitted a subgrant application? Okay. So a couple. You might be the same people who had participated in your hazard mitigation planning efforts. So you might be the ones that are in the know. For people who have not yet accessed funding, we're going to go through a little bit of the structure of how funding works through these HMA programs, these hazard mitigation assistance grant programs. And it starts here with funds, how grant funds come from the federal agency. Money is appropriated to the Federal Emergency Management Agency through Congress. So typically there is an annual allocation process and the funding gets allocated. That money is flowed down through FEMA headquarters to the regions for management. And then region works with the state in partnership to make sure that those funds are managed. The state is a pass-through entity. So they're the recipient of the grant funds, and they work with you all as local communities and eligible entities to award subgrant funds, those individual project awards. So it's a conversation, a flowing back and forth between what the projects that you want to get implemented, getting your goals and needs accomplished, working with the state to make sure that the state is also getting their goals and needs accomplished, flowing back with that conversation to region and then back to headquarters. And so this is sort of the typical process, how communication flows and how funding flows. For a long time, I talked about this role of emergency management and mitigation being one of translation, trying to translate the federal requirements into more understandable language and how to translate local needs and goals into the language that FEMA understands. Any questions about how this funding works? I want to say here too, tribal nations can both be a pass-through entity and a subgrantee. So if anyone here is a representative of a tribal nation, there is a flow there that can be accomplished either through the state or directly to FEMA region. And just for context, you all are located in FEMA Region 9, which is bundled with these couple of other states. And so whenever we talk about Region 9, that's the area that we're talking about. So thinking back to this emergency management cycle, how many people on the call here are in the emergency management field who are working and filling roles inside emergency management? Okay. Anyone else here from like a grants management? Okay, so let's see, I think I asked the question too quickly. Anyone from a grants management perspective? Anybody who's here from the finance side of the house? Okay. Funding under emergency management is broken out into two halves for mitigation purposes. And really, it's just about how that money gets allocated from the feds down. There are annual grants, non-disaster grants that hypothetically are allocated on an annual basis. So BRIC, FMA, PDM, legislatively awarded PDM, and HHPD are these more regularly scheduled programming. And then we have disaster grants that are tied to disaster events. When events occur, for those of you in the emergency management field, we have the bad day, the immediate response and recovery that occurs with that, and then HMGP, which would be associated with a presidential disaster declaration, and HMGP post-fire, which is associated with the fire management assistance grant. What's the difference and what are these for? The non-disaster grant programs have annual national funding made available. And then the disaster grant programs also have money being made available, grant programs. The disaster grant programs are not predictable. You don't know how much money is coming and you don't know where it's coming from. Bad days, fires, and any other presidential disaster declaration. So it's irregular money, as opposed to the regularly scheduled non-disaster grant programs. The difference too between these is that when you're having a non-disaster grant program, that is a national pot, national money, and the disaster grant programs are going to be directly for your state. The non-disaster grant programs are going to have this sparkly new, whatever the FEMA funding priorities are, whereas your disaster grant programs are going to be your tried and true mitigation. When you have non-disaster grant programs, regularly scheduled, immediate deadlines, one-time submission. At this point in time, we are currently waiting for the notice of funding opportunity. I'll get into what that looks like later, for the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities and the Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant programs. So these programs are federal announcements, national pots, one-time submission, one-time application, yes or no money. The disaster grant programs like HMGP post-fire, which right now is open in your state, is more of a dialogue. So you have conversations with your state about what your goals and your priorities are. There's state goals and state priorities. And that conversation and RFI process happens back with Region 2. Disaster programs, state specific, you want to have conversations with your states about what you want, what you need, and what the program is looking for. And that RFI process goes back and forth. However, the disaster programs come when you're in that state, that post-disaster confusion state of dealing with the immediate needs of what you just went through, versus when the non-disaster grant programs are coming, you're from that a little bit more, hopefully in a position of more stability when you're pre-disaster and not having to deal with the post-disaster fallout. Any questions about the two different branches so far? Okay. A lot of questions, if you've dealt with mitigation programs before, come down to the non-federal match, because this can be a big sticking point. Most of these grant programs, there's big money available. The national pots for the non-disaster funding under BRIC have capped out at $50 million, which is a big pot of money for a single project. And multiple large projects awarded under BRIC. The funding for the disaster grant programs also are big pots, not as big as 50 million. They're tied to the disaster funding amounts, but it's still money that's available here in your state for you to do mitigation work. Most of these are going to require a 25% match. There is opportunities for 90% match, or 90% federal share or 100% federal share under some of the non-disaster grant programs. And we're going to talk about how to get a decreased match in a couple of slides here too. That non-federal match can be met in a variety of different ways. I see there's a hand still up here. Was there a question? I'm just going to pause here for a second. Okay. I think there's just a lingering hand. Okay. There's a variety of different ways that you can meet that local match. Cash always is a good workaround to get your match met. However, you can also match with in-kind time. So if your position is funded by local funds or state funds, as long as it's not funded under a federal program, then you can match with your staff time, your hours. There's also utilization of your own equipment, depending on your project time. You can count the volunteer time of community participants who are coming to your meetings and events. There are some federal funds that lose their federal identity. You can also talk through, we can talk through some of those donation opportunities, partnerships, and sponsorships that come from your neighboring jurisdictions or other entities that you might want to work with, or any combination of the above from one or multiple sources. This is something we can dig into a little bit too as this training session goes on and talk about the different varieties of ways that you can meet your match, not just cash. All of this is described in detail in the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide. At the end of this slide deck, we're going to drop a bunch of links to help you if you want to go back and do any research on your own, do like a Control F for a project type or a grant program if you want to learn more. So there is a resource out there that can help you find answers on your own, but we're also here to answer questions if you have any questions about what these grant programs entail, what's eligible, what's a good project that you could submit under these grant programs. Remembering that there is this difference between the nationally available pot of money and the disaster pots of money that are more state specific. So right now, like I said, we are anticipating the release of the non-disaster BRIC and FMA notices of funding opportunity coming up here pretty soon. So that's going to be this here circle, these pre-disaster mitigation grant programs with their eligible opportunities. But we also have in the state of Nevada HMGP post-fire funding, which is open now. That application period, the state is accepting applications now, actively seeking applications. And we're going to get into that here as well in the next couple of slides. But both of these pots of money are on the table, HMGP post-fire right now, and BRIC or FMA hopefully any day now with that notice of funding opportunity. So, non-disaster grants. I'm realizing as we're speaking that when we're talking about natural hazard mitigation, we need to get a definition of what those eligible projects include. So I'm going to back up really quick here. Natural hazard mitigation, the idea behind those projects is you implement a solution for a hazard before it happens. So going back to when we were talking about the fires, or not the fires, excuse me, the flooding that happened in 2017, big, massive flooding event that occurred. A detention basin was installed prior to those floods that occurred, the river events. And that riverine flooding was lessened because of the mitigation, the construction that was done prior to those events. Wildfire thinning for fire, detention basins for flood, retrofitting of like installing hurricane straps for wind on your homes, seismic retrofits that can help stabilize large structures for earthquake. Any kind of project that will increase your community resilience when those bad days occur. So when we talk about the kinds of projects that you want to implement, you want to think about construction type projects. You want to think about your capability and capacity building type projects. And all of this we're going to get into a little bit more in our next session on eligible activities. But think about when you're going after these disaster funds, these non-disaster funds, your long-term projects and project goals that might even be ambitious. So non-disaster funding, the BRIC and FMA and PDML grant programs. Okay. The BRIC funding is Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. It is a non-disaster grant program. The notice of funding opportunities coming out very soon. They are designed to protect proactive investment and promote community resilience and adaptation in the face of extreme weather events and chronic stressors. The total project cost is up to $50 million federal share. The highest priority and most likely to be awarded focus on climate resiliency, nature-based solutions, and underserved populations. That information can all be found in the notice of funding opportunity. That document for BRIC is going to be released any day now. For FMA, Flood Mitigation Assistance Grant Program, they must protect NFIP insured properties. The highest priority and most likely to be awarded are going to be your repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss properties. So under the National Flood Insurance Program, we're talking properties that have experienced multiple events of flooding. Who in here is a certified floodplain manager? Is anyone on the call here today a CFM or involved in floodplain in any way? Okay. If you have interest, awesome, in FMA to mitigate against flooding hazard for national flood insurance policy protected structures, we can have a conversation about what project types might be eligible under FMA for those properties. PDML, pre-disaster mitigation, which is a legislatively selected project. This is somewhat infrequent and requires your legislature to identify those projects and advocate for them. So it's a little bit more nuanced. It's not one of the normal it's not one of the normal non-disaster funding types that comes up very frequently. However, it has been offered a couple of years in the past. A notice of funding opportunity. This is the document that we're waiting to come from the federal government. We're hoping for those to be released any day now, like I mentioned for both BRIC and FMA. They are the guiding document that outlines what is eligible under that program. The Hazard Mitigation Assistance Policy Guidance, that document that I mentioned before, I'll go back to show you here. Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide is going to outline all types of mitigation that's eligible under all of the grant programs. But the Notice of Funding Opportunity is going to give you more detailed specifics. It's going to tell you specifically which project types are eligible. It's going to give you exactly which amounts are going to be eligible. And it sets some parameters on different types of federal priorities. Because these annual grants are nationally available and nationally competitive, there's a small allocation per state. So there's a smaller pot that each state can shoot for. They are not required to access all of that funding, but it is the hope that each state would be able to utilize all of the funding that's allocated per each state. But there's also a larger nationally competitive pot that all applications in the state, in the nation, all subgrants are applying for that national competition and hoping to be selected. Those national priorities for the last several years have revolved around climate resilience and social vulnerability. So there are some resources here that can help you identify whether or not your community is an eligible entity for, as I was mentioning before, those higher cost shares. So, or the higher federal shares so that your local match cost share is reduced. Under BRIC in previous years, economically disadvantaged rural communities, which is a definitive defined kind of group in the BRIC NOFO, have been eligible for a reduced cost share. So they have not had to provide as much match as you would normally do under a mitigation grant. If you're going for flood mitigation assistance grant, that other non-disaster grant program, the amount of match required is going to relate to that repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss property. So that's specific to flood mitigation. And again, if you're interested in doing a project that would remove a home or a commercial property that, like a neighborhood from the repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss property from the NFIP, then we can talk about what that might look like and how to identify whether or not your property is severe repetitive loss or repetitive loss. These resources here that identify your climate vulnerability and your National Risk Index, all of this information can also help you identify for your grant applications when we get into that information, how to pull some information to justify to FEMA why your projects are a good idea. So we can talk about that too as we get into the development of applications moving forward. Disaster grants. So as I mentioned, right now the state of Nevada has open an HMGP post-fire mitigation grant funding source. So we're going to talk through what those disaster grants look like as well. HMGP, the regular hazard mitigation grant program, is allocated to states following a presidential disaster declaration. It's the basis for the disaster grant programs, and it has this breakdown of funding based off of what is an eligible project type. Again, going back to that HMGP, the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Grant Program guidance. Regular projects are going to refer to your construction type projects. Advanced assistance are going to refer to the types of projects that you have an idea, but don't quite have all of the federal requirements met. Your 5% are going to be related to that education, growing and expanding. Codes and standards are also a priority for making a more resilient housing stock so that homes aren't as damaged as they were before. And then those planning grants are the funds available to help you complete your hazard mitigation planning processes, your hazard mitigation plans. There's going to be more discussion on this in session 2, but again, thinking back to those flood events that happened in 2017, almost $3 million in state-specific HMGP funds were allocated following those events. So consider when you do have those bad days that the mitigation funding is going to come down the pipeline after that. Because the funding is allocated to the states as the pass-through entity, the states also have a say in what projects that they want to see elevated as well. Obviously, they want as many people as possible to access the funding. A more resilient community means a more resilient state. So they are going to encourage and support and assist any community that wants to access the funding. But there is state level priorities also identified to try and help where the state has identified gaps and needs. It's important to note that there is a new state level focus on protecting critical infrastructure around power and fuel. This can mean secondary power sources. This can mean hardened electrical grids. We want to make sure that power continuity throughout the state is protected and supported. There's also additional state priorities, and these are identified in the State Hazard Mitigation Plan, which is another resource we're going to link at the end of this slide deck, where you can look up and see all of the different priorities that were identified by the state as goals, which includes protecting assets from wildfire and flooding, assisting communities in the removal of biomass waste and fuels reduction. Obviously, with the number of impacts you all have experienced this year, fire mitigation is a huge focus for the state. We want to restore native and adapted vegetation throughout the utilizing the Nevada State Seed Bank program. We want to focus on projects to attain the desired forest conditions. That's also a huge focus. Again, you can see over and over and over again, protecting the communities from fire hazards and also implementing those post-fire flooding prevention opportunities as well. So when we're mitigating, we're removing as much of the risk as possible, hopefully to protect your communities from the bad day or make your communities more resilient for the future. There are also, again, those projects around education, outreach, participation, communities bonding together to help leverage their goals and accomplish mitigation across multiple different needs. HMGP post-fire, like I said, the basis of all of these disaster programs is that HMGP. So HMGP was the beginning of it, and now HMGP post-fire is a new grant that was built on top of HMGP because there was widespread national recognition that the post-fire events can be very devastating. So it's the same breakdown, that the wheel of funding is broken down in the same way. The number one priority for federal requirements are that activities should benefit the declared counties or burned tribal lands with wildfire mitigation. We want to help the burned areas not be burned again. Then we want to help the impacted areas with any projects that they've identified in their areas. The third priority is all wildfire mitigation opportunities across the state or any other mitigation projects across the state. So HMGP post-fire priorities, these are the national set goals. However, you can see that state level priorities align pretty significantly with these national priorities, and the state's going to try and assist the impacted communities as much as possible in getting projects across the finish line that can help prevent future fires or also help those downstream post-fire flooding communities. If you are interested in any of this funding, if you want to talk through projects, we're going to go through some next steps and how to move forward. You here on the call today are an engaged person who's interested in having at least a conversation. You might not have all the pieces of the puzzle. So maybe if you're on this call, there's an emergency management person that you might need some assistance from, or your floodplain manager you might need some assistance from, or your grants manager. So figuring out your team internally about who you're going to need on board. Obviously, leadership is going to need to sign off if you're even going to be thinking about having a conversation about going for some money or some projects. So just identify who on your side can help you get across the finish line and see if this is something that you're interested in doing. Understanding the process, we're going to have some contact information here in just a little bit so that we can have a conversation and just determine if the goals and needs that you've identified through some of these other priorities are going to be eligible for mitigation grant funding. Once we have those NOFOs, then we can start, reading through those and seeing if your project is going to be eligible. Then we'll go through a process of refining your project to make it meet all of the HMA requirements. And we want to make sure that we know those deadlines. So right now, at this point in time for the HMGP post-fire, we are looking for completed applications by the first week of February. And we'll talk about how to get into that running here, right here. If you have a project idea and would like some assistance in developing it further and looking at that HMGP post-fire funding, please utilize this link and submit a notice of interest. We want to make sure we identify who needs assistance. We want to identify the types of projects that might be in the works, and we want to help you move towards that February deadline to get an application out the door. And when I say we, I mean we here at Widow Bryan's are supporting the state through this application development process. So like Janelle said at the very beginning, my name is Chelsea Morganti. We are providing support to the state. I'm joined here with Aaron Buchanan and Matt Arsenault, who you'll see in the sessions coming up as we move through the rest of these training programs. We're going to be talking through all of the different pieces of these grant programs, of the project types, of how to meet your goals, what types of information is going to be required for the applications. We are here to provide support to you, to help you as you move forward, or even just to have a conversation. If you have an idea, if you have an idea, but you're concerned because you've never accessed these grant programs before, or you have no idea how you're going to be able to meet your match, or you don't really understand what the process looks like, or you have a couple of problems, but you don't know how to turn them into mitigation applications. Wherever you are in that conversation, if you have an interest in even just talking about it, we would love to have a conversation with you and see if it can develop further into a hazard mitigation assistance project. I'm going to spend the next couple of minutes here dropping, well, maybe hopefully not a couple minutes, dropping some of the links into the chat here so that you have them to access. Like I said, the first link here is to the state hazard mitigation plan. So if you want to see what the state has identified as a gap or a need, that's the first link. If you are interested in submitting a hazard mitigation notice of interest so that we have a conversation and can talk about how you want to move forward, this is going to be the second link. Let me get this here. Okay, first one is the The hazard mitigation assistance guidance popped up first. It jumped ahead. So we have first the hazard mitigation assistance guidance. If you'd like to check the FEMA document for what eligible project types are out there, just to look a little bit, if you want to do a control F for wildfire projects or anything like that. The second link is going to be to that notice of funding opportunity. The third link here is going to be to the, got the wrong link. Let me see. I'm just going to drop the whole sheet in because these are getting jumbled. Okay, so there's a variety of links there that all reference back to this HMA resources for you to access. As I mentioned, we have some additional training programs that are going to be coming up over the next couple of weeks. We're going to be delivering these training sessions. The next session is about eligible activities and matching those projects to each of the grant programs. So we're going to get into the weeds on how to identify your mitigation projects and make them into an application to access the grant funding. I'm going to go back here to the contact information, and I'm just going to ask, does anyone here have any project types that you have submitted in the past? I know some of you had identified that you had applied for mitigation grant programs in the past. Do you mind taking yourself off of mute or dropping into the chat maybe what type of project you pursued in the past? Here. So under the Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program and Policy Guide, let's see, Avalanche Education Video, HMGP, perfect. Culverts, awesome. Signage. So out of curiosity for that signage project, are you maybe thinking about the turnaround, don't drown signs? Did you put up signage about earthquake, directions, anything, earthquake response guidelines for NMBG?
This is Sabrina. It's actually the avalanche education. It's all signage for high-risk areas, how to be appropriate in areas of Washoe County that have had avalanche activity or are prone to avalanche activity, and then just generic warnings that you are in an avalanche area.
Awesome. One thing that we are seeing in a couple of different areas, particularly where you're having development expanding into communities that maybe for hundreds of years nobody has built anything in that area before, but now because communities are growing and housing and development is growing, we're moving into those areas that weren't previously developed, and oh my goodness, avalanche risk has been increasing. More roads, more people, more development in those hazardous areas, and so increased awareness and education is vital, and letting people know that not every area is as safe as we might hope it to be. So that's a great utilization of some mitigation funding, helping people be more aware in those areas. Flood mitigation through HMGP culverts. Absolutely. So we see with increased rainfall that our channels cannot pass the amount of water, or that, with increased development, we're losing some of that area where water used to be absorbed like a sponge. And so we need to work on enhancing our channels and upsizing the culverts. Maybe those bridges are being washed over. Maybe our channels are just not passing the same kind of flow. So those kinds of enhancements to our built environment can really help protect our structures. I want to talk briefly about wildfire mitigation because we have that HMGP post-fire coming up here, that grant program that's eligible, and the types of projects that Matt is going to get into, the kinds of projects that might be eligible under HMGP post-fire. So when you're talking about wildfire mitigation, there are fuels reduction where you're cutting either brush or large trees, canopy. If you are creating defensible space where you're protecting certain structures, or if you're retrofitting for non-combustible materials to protect different structures. Does anybody have any questions about wildfire mitigation, flood mitigation, any ideas about assets that you might want to protect? Perfect. Wondering if earthquake liquefaction zone mapping qualifies, could pertain to zoning and development and planning. Absolutely. I don't know if Aaron or Matt want to chime in here, but the first thing that occurs to me is you could do this as part of your planning grant. Maybe if you wanted to enhance your liquefaction zone mapping as part of your hazard mitigation planning process or as a standalone. And you could do it as part of a zoning and development if you had codes associated with that as well. Gathering data on where you might be at risk and what might be at risk is absolutely a mitigation activity. So when we talk about the types of things that you might experience post-disaster, that's like a test case for what happens when the bad day occurs. But some things like earthquake are not as regularly occurring. So people pretty generally know that floods are, they're the number one hazard in the nation. So floods are pretty regular. We kind of know what's at risk from flooding. It's a big problem that needs big solutions and is something that we can't really ever forget about because of how much need there is around the flooding hazards. But there are other big hazards that threaten us too. Obviously, for the state of Nevada, wildfire is a big concern that we need to be focused on as well. And earthquake is one that loses focus a lot because they happen so infrequently or can be so mixed in either devastation or just a little bit of rumbling. But understanding your earthquake risk, understanding what's at risk from that earthquake and what can happen when you have those bad days, absolutely. The data collection, even for flooding, if you have maybe a drought resilience plan that you're curious to maybe pursue, maybe, and that's water, but in a different way. So drought, earthquake, fire, flood, wind, anything along those lines where you want to expand your understanding of what your risks are, or if you want to implement a solution, definitely. We are trying to get funding for goat grazing, yay! But as preventative, because we've already had small fires. And we fall under the jurisdiction of a declared disaster area wildfire. It just didn't occur there specifically. Understood. So the state has not had a presidential disaster declaration in a time period where you would have an open HMGP. So right now, the funding that we're looking at is HMGP post-fire. That's the one that's open at this moment. And then hopefully soon we'll have BRIC and FMA open up. So if you are considering doing a wildfire mitigation application, let's look at HMGP post-fire. We'll help you develop that application for that particular grant program. And then if it's applicable under other programs, we can talk about that too. But the goat grazing, I love because it is essentially kind of like it's a low impact wildfire mitigation project that can leverage multiple benefits. So for anyone, is anyone curious about how goats are applicable for wildfire mitigation? It's the coolest thing. You get in contact with a local rancher or someone who does this as a business. They put out the pen, they let the goats do the brush clearing, and then you just move the pen. And absolutely, that is an eligible project opportunity for funding. And yes, absolutely would want to, particularly because you are an impacted community, we would want to see if we could get you funded under HMGP post-fire. That's a super fun application process. So the fun thing about mitigation is that there are opportunities for interesting ideas like goats. And there's fun opportunities. You were talking about signage. So there's signage. Obviously, we can fund those kinds of things. There's also opportunities for outreach and education. So when we talk about either doing like school programs, so you can have a mitigation application to discuss the Great Shakeout at an elementary school, or to bring a flood demonstration table, or for your elementary schools to do their own version of a public service announcement. So we had a project out here where school-age children were asked to create a 30-second advertisement to stay out of the arroyos. You can do a lot of fun things with outreach and education and eligible activities and things like that. So goats are a great opportunity. And thank you, Matt, for dropping in this link. Do you want to describe what you just dropped into the chat?
Oh, if you search FEMA wildfire, goat mitigation, you'll find a whole bunch of resources. You'll find some case studies, which is what I just posted here. There's another one, Laguna Beach, California, goat vegetation management. Just really fun projects. I think there was also another one completed in Colorado a few years back. Like Chelsea said, super productive, low impact, and fun for the kiddos.
Awesome. Anybody else who wants to give an example of a project either that they're considering or that they have received funding for in the past, whether related to earthquake, flood, fire? We have funded in the past on the topic of state priorities. There are generators that can be eligible for HMGP post-fire or other kinds of mitigation funding. Warning sirens for tornadoes or high wind events. Lots of opportunities. Some rain or stream gauges in some circumstances can be eligible. Lots of fun stuff. All right, I'm going to turn it back here to Janelle and ask if there is anything else. Janelle, if you'd like to close this out, any other topics you'd like us to hit on?
I thank you, first of all, very much for this presentation. It was excellent, and I hope that everybody who's on here enjoyed hearing all of this information in a little different way than what I've done in the past or what we've done in the past for these. And we're putting it out now before the NOFO for BRIC and FMA come out. So you can try to be a little bit more prepared, maybe to be ready to apply. So it's not a bunch of work trying to put your application together in a short amount of time. Unlike Chelsea, I'm keeping my fingers crossed for a January release of the NOFO because we're getting into the holidays. But we'll see. We'll see. They need a budget so that they can drop that information. It's all together. It's just waiting. So anyway, and then we'll see what the timeline ends up being because that will be adjusted as well when it finally comes down. Last year was a little bit like that. I will say that FEMA is known for taking a long time to fund projects, mitigation projects. But they are trying hard to deal with those issues that have slowed them down. And I know that a bunch of projects from last year, BRIC, some of the congressionally directed spending or the legislative PDM, they had awarded that with a hold on it, and now they've lifted that. So part of that is the funding that's coming through now. So we're happy for that, and we're hoping that we continue to see less time, for them to fund these projects. You just have to know that mitigation projects can take a while because of the process that it has to go through with environmental, especially, but some of the other things. So putting this stuff together, I'm really looking forward to the next meetings. We're going to go weekly, but I will get out a cancellation email to everybody on the weeks that we're not going to have a meeting because of the upcoming holidays, which would be a holiday where everybody's off anyway, or a week that maybe the holiday happens and the next day people are still off for the holiday. So we don't want to get into that kind of category, but is there anybody who has a topic that they would really like to see Widow Bryan's cover in these? We've kind of generally laid them out, but if there are topics that especially you want covered, come off mute and speak up, or write it in the chat like you guys have been doing. We'd love to hear from you. And if nothing else, you can always reach out to one of us, either us or one of the others. Chris, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Chris Haynes. I'm the FEMA Integrated Team Lead here in Nevada and work with Janelle on certain mitigation priorities from time to time. One request, Janelle, I think we could have would be reminding that on those application processes, when they have to project out long-term costs, we run into that question quite often from jurisdictions, whether that's again, I'm not a mitigation officer, but those long-term costs that sneak up on projects when they have to renew, and they did not include cost of inflation or employee costs or things of that nature. Thank you.
Sure, that's a great topic. Thanks, Chris. Anybody else on here who has a topic they're just dying to hear about? And as I said, you can always just reach out by email or, let's see, evacuation studies, if those fall under this education series grants. So there's another one for you. That's a good one too. Thanks, Sabrina. Okay, well, we're right at 11 o'clock, so I don't want to keep you guys any longer, but hopefully this has been helpful for you all. Questions, just reach out, please, either to Widow Bryan's or to Hal or myself. And we'll go from there, and hopefully you guys can put together some projects that will continue to make Nevada more and more resilient to these disasters that we get. And so that when something happens, nothing happens. So I'll let you all go with that. And thanks for coming. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. See you
Thank
later.
you.